again to do another First Friday lecture with you. Last year, about this time, I gave a lecture entitled, On the Cutting Room Floor, Books That Did Not Make It into the Bible, in which I looked at some of the ancient scriptures that had not, for one reason or another, been collected and included in the Hebrew Bible. This year, I'd like to go in a similar but different vein, looking at how a particular ancient text, in this case the Hebrew Bible, can, in a sense, be rewritten without changing it. And I hope that if that's not clear right now, that by the end of my talk, what I mean by that will become clear. And in particular, to look at the case of the Talmud and how this rewriting of the Hebrew Bible works in this particular case. So in order to do this, what I'd like to do is cover four things with you this afternoon. One is I'd like to talk briefly about the general problem of old texts in new situations. How do you adapt an old text to a new situation? Second, I'd like to look at a couple of case examples that are not the Talmud. One involves the Book of Mormon, and the other one involves the New Testament. And I'm going to try to show two different ways that this process of rewriting the Bible without changing a word has been accomplished in two other cases that I will outline. And then finally, with all that in hand, we'll take a look at the Talmud and how, in my estimation, a similar process is taking place with it, in which it is both extending the Hebrew Bible in one sense, but in another sense, it is actually changing its meaning, changing the meaning of the Hebrew Bible, but without actually changing any of the black ink on the page. So we'll start by just addressing the basic question of how do you adapt old texts to new circumstances, or how do you get new meanings out of old texts? And in general, this is an issue that arises repeatedly in human history as cultures continue to change and face changing circumstances while their texts, in a certain sense, don't. Cultural texts, stories about who we are, where we come from, what's important in the world, the nature of God, all those kinds of things are the very essence upon which cultures are built, personal identities are established. These stories, often sometimes called origin myths and other kinds of names, are absolutely essential for the functioning of a culture, whether religious or otherwise. Indeed, so important are these stories that one author, Alasdair MacIntyre, has said that man is essentially a storytelling animal. He continues, I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part. We enter human society, that is, with one or more imputed characters, roles into which we have been drafted, and we have to learn what they are in order to be able to understand how others respond to us and how our responses to them are apt to be construed. It is through hearing stories about wicked stepmothers, lost children, good but misguided kings, wolves that suckle twin boys, youngest sons who receive no inheritance but must make their own way in the world, and eldest sons who waste their inheritance on riotous living and go into exile to live with the swine, that children learn or mislearn both what a child and what a parent is, what the cast of characters may be in the drama into which they have been born, and what the ways of the world are. MacIntyre concludes, deprive children of stories, and you leave them unscripted, anxious stutterers in their actions as in their words. Hence, there is no way to give us an understanding of any society, including our own, except through the stock of stories which constitute its initial dramatic resource. Now, although the examples that MacIntyre has given of these stories have to do with lost children, good but misguided kings, and so on, The same concept, I hope you can appreciate, could apply to things biblical, religious. If you think about the Bible from a literary perspective in terms of the characters and the stories that are told in that, that's part of the stock that MacIntyre is talking about for our cultural resources, how we learn what's good, what's bad, where we fit into the cosmos, what we can aspire to, and so on. So far, so good. The question happens, what happens if the picture of who we are, or the cosmos, or the way we fit into things, changes over time? What happens to our stories? Well, if you live in an oral culture where things are not written down, it's kind of easy. The stories just naturally, gradually adapt over time, and nobody notices. And so even though people say, oh, this is an ancient tale that I'm now reciting to you, what in fact is happening is that it's being updated incrementally as things are changing in order to keep it relevant. But what do you do with a written text, which cannot be updated incrementally in exactly the same way? On the one hand, the written text is sitting there like a rock, and it refuses to move, and time is marching on. Society is changing. People's ideas are changing. Circumstances are changing. At some point, this stock of stories and characters, this understanding of life, is not as relevant as it once was. And yet there's a tremendous attachment to it. You don't want to lose it, and so on. So how do you go about adapting those written texts to new circumstances? And I want to suggest that in general, I think there's at least 5 ways, there's 5 that I'm aware of, in which this can be done. The first way is straightforward. I mean, they're all actually straightforward, but the first one's very simple. The first way of adapting an old text to a new situation is simply to rewrite it. Okay? Just as it was done with the oral case. Take the old one, write a new version of it, and dispense with the old version. A second way of adapting old text to a new circumstance, which works especially well if you're dealing with a collection of old texts, like you might find in the Bible, where it's essentially an anthology of different works. One way that you can adapt the old to the new is by shuffling the order, reordering the texts. So that in some sense, even though you haven't changed the words of any of the particular texts, by changing the order, you can actually get a different meaning out of the story that now goes from beginning to end. And we'll come back to that in a minute because it's actually very important in the case of the Old Testament. A third way that old texts can be given new life, so to speak, is that they can be recontextualized. And by this I mean the meaning of a text in general is more than just what's printed on the page. The meaning that we take from a story involves a kind of interaction between the text on the page and the circumstances in which we read it. And so by changing the circumstances, by changing the context in which we read a particular old text, we can give new meaning and new life to it. A fourth way of giving new meaning to old texts is simply to manhandle it and reinterpret it. In other words, we can learn, in a sense, how to misread an old text in a way that's more congenial to us. This, too, is also a favorite biblical strategy, and I'll come back to this in a moment as well. But the fifth strategy, which is the one that I really want to focus on today, the fifth strategy for adapting an old text to new circumstances is to splice a new text into the old one. Okay, it's a kind of a 3-part operation. On the one hand, we're going to create a new text. On the second hand, I don't have 3 hands. Number 1, we're going to create a new text. Number 2, we're going to splice the new text and the old text together. And number 3, we're going to hide the join and hide the seam so that we have a new unit that has new meaning. It certainly includes all of the old text that we started out with, but by adding this new and then making it look seamless, we've essentially created a new whole, and within that new whole, the original old text actually means something different when it's part of this larger whole than what it meant when it was standing on its own. And this is the case, the splicing of the new into the old, that we have in the case with the Book of Mormon, with the New Testament, and with the Talmud. But before we get to those larger examples, let me just give you a couple of examples of these other forms so you can have an appreciation of what I'm talking about. In the case of rewriting, and most of these examples I'm going to use biblical examples. The question of rewriting a text, an old text for new circumstances, is actually found throughout the Bible. Many of you who may have read the Bible, if you look, you'll find what's known in the jargon as doublets. There are a lot of stories that are apparently told twice with certain variations. There's 2 stories of creation and so on. And many people have done a lot of thinking of what are these doublets about? How did they get in here? What's their function? Well, one theory of the origin of these doublets is actually they come originally from parallel texts before the Bible that in the form that we have it was formed, and that they were sewn together, and that in fact they date from the times when Israel was divided. The ancient Israelites were divided into 2 kingdoms, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, and one of the doublets comes from the northern kingdom, one of the doublets comes from the southern kingdom, and when the Bible that we have it now was put together, they were joined together. A similar case exists with the thing which is known as the Samaritan Pentateuch. The Pentateuch is the name for the 5 books of Moses, otherwise known as the Torah. It turns out there's a group which is an ancient splinter off of ancient Judaism, known as the Samaritans, who figure a little bit in the New Testament. But they're actually a living group of people. There's about 600 people still Samaritans. And they have their own version of the Pentateuch. And it's virtually identical to the 5 books of Moses that we know, except there are certain key places where they've rewritten places where the temple is supposed to be and other activities are supposed to take place, so that it can work in the society that they lived in the north, coming from the northern kingdom of Israel rather from the southern kingdom of Judah. If you look at all these lost books of the Bible, which was my subject from last year's talk, again, you'll find that many of these books are attempts to rewrite the books of the Bible in ways that update their meaning for a later time. So rewriting is one way. Reordering the books is a second way. How the order in which you read books obviously affects their impact. And one of the key things in this context to realize is that although many people use the term the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament interchangeably, they're really not the same thing. On the one hand, they have the same contents, but the ordering of the books within the Hebrew Bible, which is what would be read within the Jewish tradition, for example, is actually different than the ordering of the books as it exists within the Old Testament, which is the way you would find it within a Christian, a Protestant, or a Catholic tradition. And I'm going to come back to why is the order different in the Christian case, because it's not an accident. Recontextualizing, some of the stories, especially when you look in the biblical stories, actually take on different meaning depending upon where you read them. And in order to appreciate this, I think you have to have a little, project a little certain empathy for the characters. But one that's relevant to today's talk about the Talmud, for example, is the book of Deuteronomy, the 5th book of the books of Moses, which is Moses' farewell speech to the Israelites, which takes place, according to the text, on the far side of the Jordan. So conceptually, there's a map in place here that divides the world to the far side of the Jordan and the other side of the Jordan, which is the Promised Land. And actually, and you could, I don't know if you could try this as a mental experiment for yourself, but reading Deuteronomy, reading Moses' last words, actually takes on a certain different valence, a different significance, depending upon actually whether you read that story on one side of the Jordan, whether you, the reader, are on one side of the Jordan or the other. A fourth case is reinterpreting an old text, and by this I really mean simply manhandling it into the sense of reading things that in some sense aren't there. And this is an ancient tradition, because this problem of what do we do with old texts in new circumstances has been in the Judeo-Christian community around for thousands of years, actually, because the really oldest texts are much older than that. So, for example, amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found in the late 40s and early 50s, is an ancient text from the end of the Second Temple period, which is known as the Commentary on Habakkuk. Now, Habakkuk is one of the biblical books of the Bible, and you could read it. And if you read it on its own, you would see that it's a prophetic book about an ancient time, roughly around the time of the Babylonian exile. Okay? Now, this book called the Commentary on Habakkuk comes from the late Second Temple period, so it's about 400, 500 years later. And what the commentary does is it goes through verse by verse of Habakkuk, and it says, okay, this is what the verse from Habakkuk says, but this is what it really means. This is what the verse of Habakkuk says. This is what it turns out all the interpretations in Habakkuk transformed the meaning of this book from being about the Babylonians and the Babylonian exile from that period. It turns out all the bad guys are now the Romans. It turns it into a contemporary story and makes it relevant. And lest you think that this is merely an ancient conceit, I have here a pamphlet I picked up a month or two ago. It's called The United States and Britain in Prophecy, which is essentially the same kind of exercise as the Commentary on Habakkuk. The fellow who's written this book has fundamentally raising and answering the question, where's the biblical prophecies about us? You know, kind of like the white Anglo-Saxon Caucasian people. And I guess that's redundant, but anyway, okay. So, and he goes through and shows how the Bible doesn't talk about any of the nations that we know in the world today by their proper names, and how by, you know, kind of knowing what the code is, you can get the proper understanding of the Bible. And he goes to prove that the British and then the Americans being descended from the British are the true Israelites. Okay, and it's really delightful. I mean, you really have to read this. I mean, but part of it comes from, he says that if you look at the Hebrew word for covenant, it's Brit. And there's a Hebrew word for man, which is roughly ish. And therefore, if you put Brit-ish together, it means man of the covenant. And then the other one, which is equally good, is that it turns out, and he quotes somebody from Yale University, and I don't know if this is true or not, but somebody from Yale University assures us that the word Saxon is a contraction of Isaac's sons, missing the I at the beginning. All right? Now, I don't want to say, you know, because this is a venerable technique of finding new meaning in an old text. And lest you think it's only for quacks, I refer you to any Bible of your choice where you will find systematically, especially if you're reading it in English, they're doing it through mistranslation, where the name of God, which would be read with, it's called the Tetragrammaton, it's 4 letters, right, which could be pronounced as Yahweh. It's a reconstruction, but probably be pronounced as Yahweh. But it's been completely eliminated from every Bible, and that people who read it, even in the original Hebrew, have trained themselves to misread the text, so that every place it says Yahweh, they see the Hebrew word, which is Adonai. All right? And it's a way of changing the meaning of the text without physically altering the black ink on the page. And you can find lots of examples of these. What I want to turn to now is the fifth case, which is how do we splice a new text into an old one? And I'm going to, as I said, look at the case of the Book of Mormon, the New Testament, and then the Talmud. But just so you're aware, this can be done with any text, and I think has been done with any other ancient texts. For example, if you look at Homer's Odyssey, one of the historical reconstructions of Homer's Odyssey is that there's actually a story in the middle, as it were. For those of you that are familiar with the Odyssey, that runs from the beginning of Book 5, where Odysseus is with Calypso. That's the beginning of the story. And it goes until he returns home and goes to bed with Penelope. And that's a story in its own right. And that what's called the Telemachia, the first 4 books, and what's called a continuation, which is the little bit after the bedroom scene at the end, are actually additions that have been spliced onto that original story of Homer in order to create the Odyssey that we know today. And that if you look at it, the meaning that one would get, the significance of the internal Odyssey, is actually quite different than the meaning that one would get when you look at the larger Odyssey as we find it now. You can also see this, since the coming weekend is going to be on the Aeneid, there's a way of looking at Virgil's Aeneid in the same perspective, because what Virgil has done with the Aeneid is to create a new, quote, new story, the story of Aeneas, but he's done it in a way that mimics the Homeric epics. And so he's created essentially a continuation of the story of the Iliad in the form of the story of the Odyssey. And so is able to kind of he's able to splice Roman history into Greek history, or Roman epic into Greek epic, in a way that's quite seamless. So let's turn now to the question of splicing something new into something old. And I think for me, this is the really fascinating case. And I'm going to use some visual metaphors, and I hope they will work out. But there's three basic issues then, I think, in splicing something new to something old. Well, I should say 4. I mean, the first one is you've got to create something new, okay? But presuming you've got the something new, how do you splice that new thing onto the old thing? Well, it's kind of straightforward. You have to, first of all, find the place in the old thing where you're going to create the join. Right? If you've done anything physical, like you put sheetrock up and you put the two things, or physically spliced rope, or it's all the same. You have to find the place in the old where you're going to create the join, and you have to prepare it in order to be joined. You have to find a place where you're going to create the join in the new and prepare it, join them, and then you have to find a way to paper over the seam so that it's not, so that it looks like it's natural or invisible. And one way of papering over the seam, there's 2 basic ways of papering over the seam. One is you make the join very nice, but the other one is you also need to tweak the beginning and ending of the story so that it creates a whole unit that makes sense. Because if the beginning and the ending and the whole unit makes sense, nobody's going to notice that little seam down the middle. Okay? You end up with in a case of a Bible or something, you end up with a new canonical unit. So let me talk briefly about the Book of Mormon, and I don't presume that anybody necessarily knows anything about the Book of Mormon, but I brought here. Mormonism and the Book of Mormon are something that originated in the United States in the early 1830s. And we don't have enough time to go through all the details of this. But the key thing that I want to suggest to you is that what the Book of Mormon is, what it purports to be, is to be a Bible for the new world. If you think about the Bible that we know, it's all about the old world. Everything happens in Jerusalem or in the Middle East someplace, or somewhere in the ancient world. And in the early 1820s, apparently, Joseph Smith, or however this came actually to be, if you think about it in a sense, there was no place in this cosmic plan, in God's cosmic plan, for the United States. I mean, we're not mentioned in the Scripture. Jesus had never saved us, and so on. Plus, there was the problem of where did the Indians come from? I mean, this was an issue. And what the Book of Mormon is and does is that it's a parallel Bible for the New World. It purports to tell the history of what happened in the Americas in parallel to all the stories that are being told in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament. So this is a Book of Mormon, and it has what you might call roughly an Old Testament part and a New Testament part, corresponding to the Old Testament and the New Testament that we are familiar with. And it includes, among other things, an account of Jesus' ministry in the New World. And it explains why the Indians are the Indians and many other things. But the key thing that I want to share with you is that for people at that time and for Mormons today, this provides a context, a way to understand what the United States is in the master plan. And it, looks like a Bible, quacks like a Bible. It's a Bible, okay? But it's more than just a Bible. Because according to the Mormon tradition, the Mormon understanding, this is called, the subtitle is, Another Testament of Jesus Christ. The idea is, this is not a replacement for the regular Bible. It's a supplement. The Bible, in a sense, is the Bible of the East, and the Book of Mormon is the Bible of the West. They're both perfectly good Bibles, and together they tell the story of the planet. Now, over time, as I said, if you look at the Book of Mormon, it looks, quacks, everything like a Bible. But over time, they've even gone further to producing an edition where this is a King James version of the Bible. It's a Book of Mormon. They publish in the same cover, the same typeface, and most importantly, if you look at the bottom, there's all these footnotes that cross-reference the stories. So you could be reading a story in the Book of Mormon, and it has footnotes to other places in the Book of Mormon, but it also has footnotes to the Bible. And you could read through this Bible, and it has footnotes to other places in the Bible, but it also has footnotes to the Book of Mormon. And through these footnotes, and through this binding and everything, these two things are created to be a single unit. And this is now a story of the planet Earth and where the various bits fit into it and so on. So in a sense, the join, and so what I want to suggest to you, here's a case where a new thing has been spliced onto an old thing in what I'm going to call a horizontal join or a parallel join. One does not succeed the other, but they stand side by side. And the joins are in the fact that the contents are similar or analogous. The format is similar. They both have an Old Testament part and a New Testament part, and Jesus is in both. When it's published like this, they look like they go together. So this gives us a new unit. And then just to bring it back to the thing I started with in the beginning, is one consequence of this is actually, if you read this as a complete unit, the meaning of the Bible by itself, what we know as the Bible, has actually been changed. But again, nobody's changed a word in it. It's exactly the same as your Bible, except for the footnotes. Okay? But when it's read in this context with the Book of Mormon, it takes on a different meaning. So now if we turn to the question of Christianity and the New Testament, there's a similar issue and a similar process that arises. When early Christianity was emerging in the early centuries of this era, there were two key questions that early Christians had to address. One of them was, what was the relationship going to be between Christianity and Judaism? What was the relationship going to be between Jews and Christians? What was the relationship going to be between the Jewish scriptures and the Christian scriptures? I mean, we know what the answer is now, but it actually took 400 years for all of these answers to be worked out. It wasn't obvious to anyone at the very beginning. The second big question that had to be worked out in the very beginning was the nature of Jesus. I mean, the precise nature. Was he a human being? Was he a God? Was he a little bit of both? Okay. Again, that's a question that took about 400 years to be resolved. These two questions in the early stages of Christianity different answers were being proposed by different early Christian sects. And so what we know today as Orthodox Christianity, or what emerged as Orthodox Christianity, didn't actually emerge until somewhere like in the 5th century, the middle of the 5th century. Now, there were many different responses or possible answers that were offered to these questions of what's the relationship between Christianity and Judaism and what's the divine status of Jesus. But let me just suggest, we're just going to focus on the Jewish one for today. There was a spectrum of answers to this question. One answer to the question of what is the relationship between Christianity and Judaism is they're the same. And in fact, there was an early sect of the Christians known as the Ebionites, and their position was that Jesus being a Jew and the sacrifice that Jesus made represented the next latest stage in the Jewish God's plan for the universe. Pure and simple. And therefore, if somebody wanted to become a Christian, he or she had to become Jewish first. Or, in other words, it meant the same thing. To become a Christian from an Ebionite perspective meant you would have to be kosher. If you were a man, you'd have to be circumcised. You'd have to observe the Sabbath, all on top of accepting Jesus as the Messiah, and so on. And of course, from this perspective, the Jewish scriptures were scriptures. There's another end of the spectrum, which was represented by a sect called the Marcionites, who were exactly the opposite. They rejected everything Jewish. They said, look, the destruction of the temple and everything which has happened historically is proof positive that Jewish way is over. It's not relevant. You don't have to become circumcised. You don't have to be kosher to be Christian. We're something else, and don't read the Jewish scriptures because they're not good for you. So here's two opposite perspectives. The solution that ultimately emerged, that we have now, was to have both, actually. To be both, for Christianity, to be both Jewish and not Jewish in a particular way. It became to be Jewish in the sense that it's understood to be a new stage in a very old plan. In fact, a plan that's been there since the beginning of time. And as part of that, necessarily, you would keep the Jewish scriptures and integrate the Christian scriptures with them. On the other hand, it's not Jewish in the sense that it's a new stage in that old plan, and the laws of Moses and so on no longer need to be followed. So you don't need to be kosher or observe the Sabbath or be circumcised if you're a man. And apparently the issue of the male circumcision was a big marketing issue among the Gentiles. So if this is what the solution is going to be, when we approach the question of the text, then we've got the Hebrew Bible, which has come into the form that we know it, slightly following the fall of the Second Temple. How can we splice these new Christian scriptures onto these old Jewish or Hebrew scriptures? Well, as I said, there's 3 steps. Prepare the join in the old, prepare the join in the new, and then paper over the join, hopefully by giving us a new ending and a new beginning and a new ending. Okay? So what's the join? Well, the join in the old goes back to the ordering of the Old Testament. And again, I'm distinguishing this from the order of the Hebrew Bible. The Old Testament, if you look at an ordering of it, culminates with the prophets, and in particular with the book of Malachi. And the reason that this ordering is what's used for the Old Testament is that you read about the beginning of the world, you read about the history of the Israelites, you read about their downfall, so on, and then you read all the prophets. And because of the nature of the books of prophecy, they're vague enough, they can be understood, and in a Christological reading, they are understood as being prophecies and foreshadowings of Jesus to come. So by putting the order of the Old Testament this way, you create the join on the old half. To create the join on the new half, if you look at the way the Gospels, again, the order of the New Testament is not random. So, for example, the first Gospel that's presented, which may not be the oldest, but it's the first one which is presented, is the Gospel according to Matthew. And the Gospel according to Matthew begins an account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah, and it goes on and on, one of these like long begat chains where everybody's eyes glaze over. And then it comes to, it says, so all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations, and then it talks about the birth of Jesus. Okay? So by creating this genealogy that ties, and it's a question everybody raises, but if it's a virgin birth and so on, why does the genealogy matter? Right? It's not his dad. Joseph is not his dad. But from a literary point of view, we're not interested in the DNA. From a literary point of view, the genealogy is important because it fuses the story that's about to come. It's the join between the story that's about to come and the story that's just concluded in the Old Testament. Now, there's the join in the old is Malachi, the join in the new is Matthew. The third thing then is to paper over the seam. And as I said, one way to do that is to rewrite the beginning and the end. Well, the way the New Testament rewrites the end of the story is simple. It just puts the book of Revelation out there, okay, at the end. So if you look at the volume of the Bible as we have it today, it's an anthology that starts with Genesis, goes through a whole bunch of stuff, and ends with Revelation. That's a story. It's a hell of a story, all right? That's a different story than if you just read the Hebrew Bible in isolation. But there's another way that the gospel papers over the seam, and this is through the beginning of the gospel according to John. The beginning of the gospel according to John begins, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it." And then it goes on, and then it talks about Jesus, leads up through John the Baptist, and then Jesus' ministry. But again, the phrasing, the opening of the Gospel of John, "In the beginning was the Word," is not an accident. It's a direct echo, parallel of the opening of Genesis. "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Well, why? The point is, in a sense, is that once you've read the Gospel of John, you can never read Genesis the same ever again. Okay? That in a sense, it turns out there was something before the beginning, and it was called the Word, and that this is the beginning of creating a whole Christological reading of the Bible. So there we've got a seam, and what I would call, in this case, with the Book of Mormon, I said it's a horizontal or a parallel seam. In this case, it's a vertical or a sequential seam, because you're taking the chronology from the Old Testament and then adding on the chronology of the New Testament. So, once again, the meaning of the Old Testament in the Bible that goes from Genesis to Revelation, the meaning of the Old Testament is actually different here than without that kind of context. And yet again, the words themselves have not been changed. And here's an example of what I would call rewriting the Bible without changing a word. So let's finally turn to what everybody came to hear about, which is the case of the Talmud. And in this case, the issue has to do with the invention of Rabbinic Judaism. I'm going to submit it as a hypothesis for your consideration, that Rabbinic Judaism, by which we mean Judaism that is dominated by rabbis, which is a form that we kind of know today, is in fact, it's ancient, but it's not that ancient. Okay, that it's actually something that was created largely following the destruction of the Second Temple, that it came into being around the same time that Christianity came into being, and in fact, in some sense, it came into being a little bit after Christianity, so that in some sense, some important sense, Rabbinic Judaism is actually younger than Christianity, and that they're sister religions rather than one being the mother religion, the other one being the daughter religion. The issue then comes in, how does this invention take place, and what are the textual components of it? We have the Bible, that's not changing. The emergence of Rabbinic Judaism is associated with the emergence of a number of rabbinic texts, which are not as widely read in the general public as the Bible is, but which are crucial to understanding the invention of Rabbinic Judaism. And these are what we're going to call generically here largely the Talmud. Okay? The Talmud is a combination of two parts. One is called the Mishnah, and the other one is the Gemara. The Mishnah was actually composed first. It's essentially a book of laws that were produced roughly around 200 CE. Now, it's claimed that these were handed down largely by oral tradition from antiquity mostly, and whether that's historically accurate or not I think it's an interesting and perhaps open question. And the nature of these laws, it's like reading the Internal Revenue Code. It's what you have to do, what needs to be done to operate the temple, what needs to be done to observe the holidays properly, all the rules to observe a proper Jewish life. And in the post-destruction of the temple environment, this was essential in order to both create something solid to guide people's lives by, and also to kind of record how the temple was operated. In case it turns out we get to rebuild the temple again, we'll know how it's supposed to function. The second piece of the Talmud is called the Gemara, which means the completion, which ends up being commentary on the Mishnah. Okay? It turns out the Mishnah, the law code, the internal revenue code of Judaism, in some sense, was very compressed, very cryptic, and just like any text, open to lots of interpretation. And of course, people began interpreting it immediately. Out of this process emerged two Talmuds. I mean, there's more than one. Just like there's 4 Gospels, there's 2 Talmuds. There's the Jerusalem or Palestinian Talmud, which was produced by rabbis in the land of Israel, which was finished around the year 350. And then there's the Babylonian Talmud, which was produced by rabbis operating in Babylon, and it was produced or finished around the year 550. So it's about 200 years later. The Babylonian Talmud is what is generally meant by the Talmud, right? The Jerusalem one, the Palestinian Talmud has kind of disappeared. So when people talk about the Talmud or Talmudic Judaism, largely what they mean is the Babylonian Talmud. Okay, well this is great. Rabbinic Judaism has produced a new set of texts. It's got the laws that are supposed to be followed. It's got the commentary on those laws. But how do you connect it to the old? How do you take this new text and connect it to the old text? Well, the theme for creating this is a book that's known as Pirkei Avot, or Avot, which is one of the tractates of the Mishnah. And unlike all the other tractates of the Mishnah, which are all legal code, the Avot tractate is more in the form of sayings or proverbs or little bits of narrative. Okay, in some ways it's the most interesting, and therefore it's also the most read, and it's also reproduced in many prayer books and so on. And what I want to suggest to you is that this book, this tractate, actually performs the work of creating the seam between the Hebrew Bible, which has existed, and this new literature of the Talmud, which has just been created. And that this is both going to create the seam by joining it, the new to the old, and papering over the seam itself. So the first question is, where is the seam in the Hebrew Bible that this is going to add on to? Okay, with the New Testament, the seam in the Old Testament was the book of Malachi. The seam where the place in the Hebrew Bible where Avot joins onto is the book of Deuteronomy. Otherwise known in Hebrew, it's known as Devarim. It means the words. The opening line to the book of Deuteronomy is, "These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel on the far side of the Jordan." Okay? So, Pirkei Avot begins, Moses received Torah at Sinai and handed it on to Joshua, Joshua to elders, and elders to prophets, and prophets handed it on to the men of the great assembly. They said 3 things: be prudent in judgment, raise up many disciples, make a fence for the Torah. Simeon the righteous was one of the last survivors of the great assembly. He would say, on 3 things does the world stand: on the Torah, on the temple service, on the deeds of loving kindness. Antigonus of Soko received the Torah from Simeon the righteous. He would say, do not be like servants who serve the master on condition of receiving a reward, but be like servants who serve the master not on condition of receiving a reward, and let the fear of heaven be upon you. Now, Pirkei Avot is divided into 5 chapters. This is the beginning of the first chapter. And the first 4 chapters continue basically in this vein. Okay? What's missing, what's left out from this translation, is that the word underlying, and they said 3 things. The Hebrew word which is being translated there is Devarim. It's the same word that's the name for the book of Deuteronomy. There's a sense in which, if you think about the 5th book of the Hebrew Bible as being not Deuteronomy, but the words that Moses spoke, which is what it would be under its Hebrew name, this is the book of the words that the fathers spoke. And in fact, the story takes off from exactly the end of Deuteronomy, because the first line here is Moses got the Torah and passed it on to Joshua. Well, if you look at the end of Deuteronomy in the book of Joshua in the Bible, that's exactly what happens there. Moses passes the torch on to Joshua. So here's the seam on the new side. It's connecting into the end of the book of Deuteronomy, or the book Devarim in Hebrew. How do we paper over the seam? How do we obscure the fact that there was a seam? And I just point out that I think that link that I've just pointed out, it's analogous to the opening of the Gospel of Matthew, right? It's doing exactly the same work. Matthew has the genealogy so that Jesus can appear to be part of the ancient tradition. And Pirkei Avot is opening with this spiritual genealogy of masters and disciples, people who have been transmitting the Torah, so that the sages, the rabbis, are connected into the old. The 5th book of the 5th chapter of Pirkei Avot does the equivalent of what the Gospel of John does by rewriting the beginning. I mean, the beginning. This is how it goes. By 10 acts of speech was the world made. And what does Scripture mean by saying God said 10 times? And is it not so that with a single act of speech, the world could have been brought into being? But it is to exact punishment from the wicked, who destroy a world which was created through 10 acts of speech, and to secure a good reward for the righteous, who sustain a world which was created through 10 acts of speech. There are 10 generations from Adam to Noah to show how long-suffering is God. For all those generations went along spiting him until he brought the water of the flood upon them. There are 10 generations from Noah to Abraham to show you how long-suffering is God. For all those generations went along spiting him until Abraham came along and took the reward which had been meant for all of them. 10 trials were inflicted upon Abraham, our father, may he rest in peace, and he withstood all of them, to show you how great is his love for Abraham, our father, may he rest in peace. 10 wonders were done for our fathers in Egypt, and 10 at the sea. 10 blows did the Holy One, the Blessed, bring upon the Egyptians in Egypt, and 10 at the sea. 10 trials did our fathers inflict upon the Omnipresent, the Blessed, in the wilderness, as it is said, yet they have tempted me these 10 times and have not listened to my voice. 10 wonders were done for our fathers in the temple. A woman never miscarried on account of the stench of the meat of holy things, and the meat of holy things never turned rotten. A fly never appeared in the slaughterhouse. A high priest never suffered a nocturnal emission on the eve of the Day of Atonement. The rain never quenched the fire of the altar. No wind ever blew away the pillar of smoke. An invalidating factor never affected the omer, the 2 loaves, or the showbread. When the people are standing, they are jammed together. When they go down and prostrate themselves, they have plenty of room. A snake and a scorpion never bit anybody in Jerusalem. And no one ever said to his fellow, the place is too crowded for me to stay in Jerusalem. 10 things, 10 devarim, were created on the eve of the Sabbath at twilight. And these are the mouth of the earth, the mouth of the well, the mouth of the ass, the rainbow, the manna, the rod, the shamir, letters, writing, and the tablets of stone. And some say, also the destroyers, the grave of Moses, the ram of Abraham our father. And some say, also the tongs made with tongs, with which the first tongs were made. Now, if you've never seen this before, and I don't know how clear hearing it from me the first time will be, but what I want to point out here is that what I've just read are actually the first 6 Mishnayot of this tractate. There's 6 of them. And what I'd like to suggest to you is that what's being done here implicitly is a summary. It starts with the creation, and it ends with the eve of the Sabbath. But it's the 6, but it's not just the 6 days. It's the 6 ages of Israel, in a sense. This is a compressed history of Israel into 6 phases: the creation, Noah, Abraham, so on and so on, which leaves us positioned at the end of this passage on the eve of the Sabbath. Now, here's a trick question. What comes after the eve of the Sabbath? Sabbath. Good. Okay. And herein lies, the secret, I think, in some sense. What the opening of chapter 5 of Pirkei Avot is saying to us is that in the ages of the history of Israel, which is the history of the world as far as these people are concerned, we find ourselves today, on the cusp, on the eve of Sabbath, but not understood as days, but as ages of the world. We stand, in fact, on the eve of the cosmic Sabbath, otherwise known as the world to come. So we're positioned today on the eve of the cosmic Sabbath, and the $64 bazillion question is, what will it take to turn the clock to get us in to the cosmic Sabbath, to get us into the world to come? The rest of chapter 5 of the Pirkei Avot describes various characteristics of the world we live in and of the rabbinical sages and so on, and then returns to the history of Israel and to the importance of studying Torah, which is what all these sayings have been about. It's about studying the Bible, the Word of God, that thing that has been handed down to Moses, from Moses, through the fathers, all the way into the Talmud, to us. And this is the conclusion, and then I'll conclude as well. The conclusion of the Pirkei Avot, chapter 5, is, in any loving relationship which depends upon something, when that thing is gone, the love is gone. But any which does not depend upon something will never come to an end. What is a loving relationship which depends upon something? That is the love of Amnon and Tamar. And which does not depend upon something? That is the love of David and Jonathan. Any dispute which is for the sake of heaven will in the end yield results, and any which is not for the sake of heaven will in the end not yield results. What is a dispute for the sake of heaven? This is the sort of dispute between Hillel and Shammai. And what is one which is not for the sake of heaven? It is the dispute of Korach and all his party. He who brings merit to the community never causes sin, and he who causes the community to sin, they never give him a sufficient chance to attain penitence. Moses attained merit and bestowed merit on the community, so the merit of the community is assigned to his credit. As it is said, he executed the justice of the Lord and the judgments with Israel. Jeroboam sinned and caused the community to sin, so the sin of the community is assigned to his debt. As it is said, for the sins of Jeroboam, which he committed, and wherewith he made Israel to sin. Anyone in whom there are these 3 traits is one of the disciples of Abraham, our father. But if he bears 3 other traits, he is one of the disciples of Balaam the wicked. A generous spirit, a modest mien, and a humble soul. He is one of the disciples of Abraham, our father. A grudging spirit, an arrogant mien, and a proud soul. He is one of the disciples of Balaam the wicked. What is the difference between the disciples of Abraham, our father, and the disciples of Balaam the wicked? The disciples of Abraham, our father, enjoy the benefit of their learning in this world, and yet inherit the world to come, as it is said, that I may cause those who love me to inherit substance, and so that I may fill their treasures. The disciples of Balaam, the wicked, inherit Gehenna and go down to the pit of destruction, as it is said, but you, O God, shall bring them down into the pit of destruction. Bloodthirsty and deceitful men shall not live out half their days, but I trust in you. Judah ben Tema says, be strong as a leopard, fast as an eagle, fleet as a gazelle, and brave as a lion, to carry out the will of your Father who is in heaven. He would say, the shameless go to Gehenna, and the diffident to the Garden of Eden. May it be found pleasing before you, O Lord our God, that you rebuild your city quickly in our day, and set out portions in your Torah. He would say, at 5 to Scripture, 10 to Mishnah, 13 to religious duties, 15 to Talmud, 18 to the wedding canopy, 20 to responsibility for providing for a family, 30 to fullness of strength, 40 to understanding, 50 to counsel, 60 to old age, 70 to ripe old age, 80 to remarkable strength, 90 to bowed back, and at 100, he's like a corpse who has already passed and gone from this world. Ben Bagbag says, turn it, the Torah, over and over, because everything is in it, and reflect upon it, and grow old, and worn in it, and do not leave it, for you have no better lot than that. Ben Hey says, in accord with the effort is the reward. And that's the end of the Pirkei Avot. And I'd just like to point out a couple of things that happened in this last passage. First of all, we're hitting like all the big names of Jewish or Israelite history. We've got David, we've got Abraham, we've got Moses, we've got Jeroboam, who he's the principal schismatic, led to the separation of the northern kingdom from the southern kingdom. So if we're hitting all the heavy hitters in Jewish history. But you end up with this idea of what the ideal life is, the ideal lifespan is. Is this one that's spent growing up into and old in the study of the Torah? And the reward is great. What is the reward? Well, I think the reward that's partly being suggested here is that if everybody lives their life this way, if we all study Torah like this, we can make the clock tick. And when the clock ticks, the cosmic Sabbath will have arrived. And depending on how woo-woo you are, I mean, either like, okay, cosmic, rapture or something like that. Or the truth is, if everybody lived that way, it would be cosmic Sabbath. I mean, without any changes at all. Okay? And the last thing I would note is that one of the things that this text does is that it rabbinifies the Bible. So, for example, Abraham he's not just our father, but we are disciples of his, which means he's a master of ours. He's a rabbi. But if you look in Genesis, I don't think he's not a rabbi. Here he's a rabbi. So to bring this all together then, in the case of the Talmud with the Pirkei Avot, what I would call the invisible invention of the Jewish New Testament, in a certain sense, is being accomplished here. Only it's not like the Christian New Testament in the sense of being vertical or sequential, because it's not chronological. It's like the Book of Mormon one, in which it's being created parallel, horizontally. The Jewish New Testament, this so-called oral law, which stands parallel to the written law, exists side by side. I don't actually have them here, so you have to visualize. Here's my written scripture, my Tanakh, and here's my Talmud. Here's my Pirkei Avot, Mishnah, and Gemara. And they exist side by side. And the place where they join, okay, this is where I'm going to close. So you follow me visually here, because I did this in class the other day, but I had a blackboard, and here I don't have a blackboard. Okay? If you can follow with me the books of the Bible, okay? If you think about it, we're going to go top down. So we have the 5 books of Moses. Start with Genesis, and go Exodus, and then end with Deuteronomy, or Devarim, the words of Moses. And in the normal Bible, from Devarim, from Deuteronomy, we go to Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. That's the Bible, right? From the creation, Moses, Joshua, okay. In the Talmud, with Pirkei Avot, we go Genesis, Exodus to Deuteronomy, but instead we go to Pirkei Avot, the Devarim of the fathers. And then from Pirkei Avot, we go to the Mishnah, and then from the Mishnah, we go to the Gemara. So we have 2 branches. The joint point is Deuteronomy, Devarim. And in a sense, the book Pirkei Avot functions like an alternate book of Joshua. And then this is really where I will end. If you think about what the story of the real Hebrew Bible is, that one that goes through Joshua through Kings, it's a very much of a this worldly story. It's about the covenant that God has with the Israelites, the promised land, the loss of the promised land, it's all about this world and getting the promised land. In this strand, the promised land is not an issue. What the issue is the world to come. And how, in this one, if we're good, we get the land of Canaan. In this one, if we're good, we get the world to come. And in my impression, those are 2 radically different schemes, stories. And yet, and this is where I started, the meaning of the Bible, therefore, has been radically altered by the creation of this Pirkei Avot and the Talmud. And yet, it hasn't physically been rewritten in any sense at all. Thank you very much for your attention.